Two, one, you're on.
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for my tardiness. As I said, I was taking a quick look at my notes. Today's session, we're going to be discussing cultural and spiritual considerations in hospice and palliative care. There's a saying that I just wanted to share with you guys as I move forward into the session on today. Yo-Yo Ma, who was an American cellist, made the quote, "Our cultural strength has always been derived from our diversity of understanding and experience." I thought that was kind of noteworthy. I wanted to share that with you guys today. Let me get my slideshow to moving. Of course, I'm Marquetta. You've met Jamie. You've seen Lisa. Gonna meet Ann and Catherine. We do go over these every week just to make sure that you guys have access and know. Of course, this is the lmhpco.org. The login is your email. Your temporary password is pass1234 exclamation point.
That's what you need to get your survey and your certificate. You have to be able to log in order to collect all of that stuff.
Yes, and we are currently compiling all of the training materials that you guys are getting weekly. And this is a snapshot of the front page where if you'll see more in this section in the corner, that's where you'll find the videos from these sessions housed. Today is Tuesday, April 29th. We're going to be discussing cultural considerations. After today, there'll be 4 more sessions. Actually 3 more that are LNEC, and then that final session will be the minimum state minimum standards for hospice that Ms. Ann Walker will be providing for you guys. Just want to remind you by way of timing, next Tuesday on May 6th, we'll start at 1 o'clock because it's a 1.5-hour course, as well as the following Tuesday, May 13th, is grief, loss, and bereavement. It's also will begin at 1 o'clock. Of course, requirements for continuing education credit. Of course, Jamie's going to let you know after the session when to log in and put your email address. The website is up and running now, so you shouldn't have a problem finishing up the surveys once it's done so that you can evaluate and get your credits. And of course, the video of every session is available. However, it's available for your viewing only. It's not available in order for you to receive credit. You will have to have participated during the session in order to get that actual credit. However, it will be available as a resource. Yes,
and
sir.
let me just say one thing. Apology. Our website was down last week, went down last week, and as a result of that, I could not send out the surveys for last week's session until Monday. This past Monday, you should see that. All of you who attended should have received an email with the link to the evaluation and the certificate for last week's session. We will be sending out today's either this afternoon within 24 hours of today's session. Thank you.
Uh-huh. All right, so today, as we talk about some cultural and spiritual considerations in hospice and palliative care, got a couple of objectives we're going to look at. Going to identify the dimensions of culture and the influence that it has, that and spirituality has on palliative care across the spans of life. Going to take a look at some of the aspects of a cultural and spiritual assessment in those patients that are near the end of life. And also look at the role of the team as we provide cultural and spiritual sensitivity and provide that care that's related to that. According to the NCP guidelines, from the cultural aspects of care, the IDT team members, they're going to do that, provide an assessment. They're also going to be respectful of values, beliefs, traditions, anything that's related to health, the caregiver, the illness, decision-making roles, so that as a whole, to be able to provide that culturally sensitive palliative care. What that looks like from a global perspective is that that team delivers care that respects that patient, their beliefs, their values, their practices, the language, the communication preferences that they have, and takes all of that and builds on the strengths of that patient as they provide care for them. And of course, from a communication and language, we have to make sure that that patient, their preferred language and style of communication is supported in every interaction that you have with them while they're providing or receiving hospice care. We're going to open up today with just a video clip. I hope that it shows today. But, I think if we take the billions of people in the world, a way to look at it from a cultural standpoint is to think that as we live in a diverse society and we serve in a diverse society, what if the whole world was just 100 people? Let me see if I can get this video going for you. Of course, let me get that commercial off of there.
Your slide is still up, Mark. It's not going to.
Okay, hold on. Let me get back there.
You're gonna have to, and you're gonna have to enable the sound. Don't forget.
Yeah. Yeah.
Way to make another
There we go.
take over.
Is it showing?
You can hide.
Is it showing, Jamie? I can't
Yes,
see.
ma'am. It is.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, making sure.
Hold all your feelings inside. You could try to carry on when all you wanna do is cry. And maybe someday we'll figure all this out. Try to put an end to all our doubt. Try to find a way to make things better now. And maybe someday we'll live our lives out loud. We'll be better off somehow. Someday. Now wait and try to find another mistake. If you throw it all away, then maybe you could change your mind. You can run. And when everything is over and done, you could shine a little light on everything around you. Man, it's good to be someone. And maybe someday we'll figure all this out. Try to put an end to all our doubt. Try to find a way to make things better now. And maybe someday we'll live our lives out loud. We'll be better off somehow. Someday.
Nope, it stopped.
I don't wanna wait, I just wanna know. I just wanna hear you tell me so. Give it to me straight, tell it to me slow. 'Cause maybe someday we'll figure all this out. We'll put an end to all our doubt. Try to find a way to just feel better now. And maybe someday we'll live our lives out loud. We'll be better off somehow. Someday. Well, sometimes we don't really notice just how good it can get. So maybe we should
So I'll ask if that particular, having taken a look at that particular video, anybody have a perspective that you want to talk about? Just thinking about the whole world being 100 people?
Yeah. It took me a while to get my head around the concepts of what they were throwing up. And once they did, it was like, oh, once I got my head around only 100 people in the world, and this is how many people in those different situations would exist in those different situations. Uh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I
Okay,
thought it was
that's
pretty neat.
yeah.
Anybody else want to share on that as far as what it looks like? Or I guess, when you think about the diversity of the society that we live in, imagining it being 100 people total versus billions of people kind of gives us a more granular view of that, I think.
Especially with regard to the situation we're dealing with. I wonder how
Yes,
many of that 100 would be imprisoned.
right. I looked for that um, to see if it was going to show any of that, but I think the overall message was that it concluded with emphasis on the desire for, peace, happiness, for health, for the importance of equal education, wealth distribution, and human rights for just a better place. So yeah, it spoke volumes after, once, I guess, to be able to really understand where they were coming from on that. I thought it was kind of neat. I just wanted to share it with you guys today. And I don't know why my video is, can you guys see my, hang on. Oh, I lost it. There it goes. Hang on. Sorry. Share. There we go.
You're back. You're back.
I'm back. Okay. All right. I just have to get back to the right screen now, to the right video. There we go. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. So, looking at hospice and palliative care, the cultural considerations, we're looking at by 2030, baby boomers are going to be 65 or older, retirement age out of 1 in 5 Americans. By 45, of course, the U.S. population is expected to become a majority today and minority tomorrow kind of thing. And then groups that have multiple races or biracial or triracial, that's going to be the fastest growing racial group in the United States between up until 2060. When you define culture, that's a system of shared symbols that serve to guide as a guide for all of our interactions, how we communicate, how we get along, how we speak with others. The cultural practices, of course, they're going to provide safety and security, give that sense of integrity and belonging. Culturally, pretty much fundamentally shapes how people make meaning out of, sickness or suffering or even death. It also can kind of perceive how it can reflect on how people perceive the entire healthcare system just based upon their culture. Because oftentimes, the tendency for the understanding of a culture is that assumption that people hold the belief and values based on their race, their ethnicity, and even their religious affiliations. Sometimes it's more effective to get to know the person and to see the meaning of their culture from their perspective than trying to look them up in books or handbooks, because I don't know if you guys are seeing the way that I'm seeing, but even the emergence of even deeper subcultures every single day. You used to could look at people and kind of tell a little bit about them. Not anymore. And don't even try it. If you want to be respectful, just don't even try it. But a person's culture holds beliefs about illness, and it significantly influences their reaction to, say, a life-threatening illness. And it also provides that foundation for all of the life experiences. There's no one size fits all, no singular approach to palliative care because it's constantly evolving. Quite literally, there are so many cross-cultural dynamics as it relates to palliative care. And of course, all these interact to create that context where we get experiences of life, including that patient's relationship, and even their expression of pain and suffering. Of course, and there are certainly intra-ethnic, I think is what it's referred to, variation, which means there's more than one variation within a cultural group across cultural groups. So like I was saying earlier, lots and lots of subcultural groups. So as we strive to understand or get a better idea of culture, realizing that it's a process, we have to remember that, attempting to understand and respectfully engage with other cultures is not a one size fits all. It's not a hit it and get it quick type thing. It's more of a process. If we're going to exhibit or allow ourselves to be culturally humble or exhibit cultural humility, have to be sensitive to the cultures around us. Is definitely also necessary in hospice and palliative care, just like it is in any other arena of providing help. Got to go into every situation with an open mind and keeping our own individual and personal perspectives. They are one of many of a larger community that we serve. And we should, try to create a shared understanding of, the patients, and even the volunteers that are taking care of the patients. We have to keep in mind that everyone has their own lenses with which to review healthcare, end of life care as it relates to that. Being able to be culturally competent, of course, or to be culturally competent doesn't mean that you have it all understood about every single culture. It doesn't mean that you're the authority in beliefs and value systems of every culture. But what it does mean is that you got to respect for all the cultural differences. You want to learn, you want to better understand, and you're willing to accept that there are so many different ways of taking a look at the world or taking care of the people that we do. And of course, self-reflection, lifelong learning, have to be able to do that in order to accept and understand and even incorporate different beliefs and healthcare practices. So here we see cultural humility, and basically it's the other-centered approach is what it looks like. Being able to be open to self-reflect. I'm going the wrong way. To be egoless, let me say that. To be without an ego going into this, realizing and understanding that humility or just throwing away our ego. Being able to provide some supportive interactions. So that intersection of existence among folks that result in positive exchanges. Self-awareness, that's being aware of our own strengths, our own limits, our own values, our own beliefs, and even our own behavior and how we look to other people. Self-reflection and critique, of course, that's that process of just reflecting on my own thoughts, my feelings, and my actions. When we think about being culturally sensitive, of course, we gotta be aware of and get into the process of being sensitive while being engaged also of being humble or being culturally humble. The components of both sensitivity and humility, they're evident in these key points that are here on the slide. That's being aware of one's own culture, learning how to conduct a cultural assessment. We'll kind of get into that a little bit. Being or becoming knowledgeable about different cultures, worldviews, especially cultures within the population that you guys serve. Seeking those opportunities to get into and engage in encounters with those various cultures as you serve and as you provide care. And also being committed to strive in order to be culturally competent. So professional self-assessment of culture. Of course, the starting point in becoming culturally sensitive is self-assessment. That's important for me to recognize my own culture and how it affects all of the interactions that I have, all of the decisions that I make, the language that I speak, and the behavior that I exhibit. Because every one of us have our own culture, and it's based on things like our culture, life experiences, but that culture influences our interests, our emotions, our biases, and how we even look at the world. So as we strive to become culturally aware and sensitive and humble, we have to understand that our own definition of culture helps uncover areas to assess in others. There is a free test, and it's in the resources, where of your own attitudes and beliefs, and actually it's an implicit bias, just a survey, because sometimes people have biases that they don't even realize that they have. We hold attitudes or stereotypes that are sometimes unconscious, but they're based on the experiences and learned associations. So sometimes we hold a negative stereotype about other people because of what they look like, or their age, or their orientation, or their weight, their race, or even religion, without even really consciously being aware of it. Some examples of implicit bias, of course, stop and think about these questions when you and how you would respond to them. Take a look at your own personal assumptions and your biases. Do you always assume someone is cisgender unless they tell you otherwise? Do you assume that a woman with a man are husband and wife? Do you assume that two women are just sisters? Do you think you can tell someone's sexual identity based on your experiences? These are some ways that we can actually look at our assumptions, our own thoughts, because believe it or not, implicit bias actually starts to be formed from the age of 2 to 5. So those attitudes are formed, and they affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions. So implicit biases that are detrimental can be unlearned, because that's the good news, by taking steps to control those automatic negative responses to biases and to opinions. Components of cultural assessment. So when we start thinking about completing a cultural assessment, these are some of the things that we look for. The identity of that patient's family, who they refer to as family, and their community. Of course, in the population, their cellmate are going to be their family, or considered a part of their community. And of course, other components of a cultural assessment include birthplace, ethnic, race, family, life, network, some community, the decision-making processes, language, and even communication. Some deeper components of a cultural assessment, of course, relates to religion and spirituality, dietary, the economic situation, the gender identity, whether it's an opportunity to express their gender or even their sexual orientation, the abilities that we have to respect and understand the rights of all people to be involved in making decisions about their health care, and find some appropriate accommodations to make sure that they understand what they're hearing, seeing, and reading, to understand as it relates to their diagnosis and prognosis. Of course, health and illness, health and healing beliefs, migration experience, the history of trauma and or torture. These things further identify with looking at the components of a true cultural assessment, being able to dig deep to figure out where these people are basically coming from. Some cultural considerations in clinical practice, of course, looking at the idea of communication. We know that communication is the basis for quality care, period. Quality palliative care, quality hospice care, quality care in general, period. And there are a lot of cultural considerations that really affect communication. And we have to kind of be cognizant and aware of those things. And of course, realizing that it's a case-by-case spaces. And just as the nurse would provide a care plan for the patient's physical being based on that patient's needs, then say for instance, the social worker would provide psychosocial care plan based on that patient's emotional or psychosocial needs. So with that with that thought in mind, keep in mind about the idea of safe space. Got to create an environment that's welcoming and allows that individual to feel trust. Of course, be open to that patient's preferences as to how to move forward. The conversational style, of course, typically as much as they can, and we allow autonomy and allow them to speak for themselves as much as possible to make those decisions. Simple things like making sure that we are pronouncing their name right. They may have entered into the corrections with a surname, but have adopted a different name from some cultural differences or some cultural changes that they made. So making sure that we can respect that. Keeping in mind the personal space, how close is appropriate? How close is it? When do you draw the line and become disrespectful based on the culture that's within the prison walls? Being able to make sure that we understand what that looks like. Whether or not eye contact is relevant or important, touch, healthcare professionals, and how patients may actually view the people that are taking care of them across the IDT team. And of course, keeping in mind that the healthcare literacy, everyone's level is not the same. So being able to understand for the patient to understand what's going on, what's going to happen, treatments sometimes has to be brought to the level of their understanding. And then, of course, being able to use interpreters. And here I would speak to the idea of sometimes tagging in that social worker, tagging in that chaplain, because the interpretation is not always because of a language barrier. It could just be because of some psychosocial barriers or some spiritual barriers as well. So please keep that in mind. So open communication, just opening the door, introducing yourself, letting them know who you are and what you're going to be doing, whether or not you use pronouns, because that's a going thing now, I think. So asking permission, is it okay if I ask you these questions? Because remember, we want to be able to give them as much autonomy as possible. We want to be able to refer to them. And as long as they're able to cooperate, we want to be able to let them. So, like I said earlier, being able to correctly pronounce the name. Is their preferred pronoun? What gender do you identify? How do you express yourself? And of course, anything you want to tell me that will ensure that you get what you want. And then just thanking them for being able to share. Because again, keep in mind, there's a lot of closed mouth and a lot of that's my private business. So in order sometimes to be able to care and to provide care, you have to be able to get that level of trust. And I know trust is a rare resource in corrections, I'm sure. So looking at the cultural considerations of a family. So who is the family? Like I said earlier, a band of brothers, or, this is family from the outside sometimes have become estranged. And so folks behind the prison walls began to reach out to the people that they share cell space and time with, that those become their family. And of course, we talked about this a little bit last week about being able to that you guys would look out for the family on the front end to see if there is a proxy or if there's someone that's related to that patient that's outside of corrections to be able to make those decisions. And of course, who would be included in the discussions, and is full disclosure to that patient and family, of course, acceptable. Oh, and one thing I wanted to just mention, I think I made note of that, but keep in mind that lots of cultures, they got rules or that unspoken understanding that there are certain members of the family that make decisions, certain members that are in on this discussion, but not on that one, some that are responsible for determining, this, but just always keep in mind that we want to make sure that we have up front, if there is a family member that's outside that could be involved, that we get that on the front end as opposed to waiting. There's an impact, of course, from on serious illness, health equity in serious illness, and of course, um, a lot of those related issues are cultural disparities as it relates to serious illnesses. So, of course, there's increase on, you know, first of all, first and foremost, being in corrections, just being the kind of the stigma that, you know, folks in correction don't get appropriate care. Uh, Looking at being able to have access to pain and pain management and symptom management, whether or not there are any gender issues or reversals of roles. And of course, disparities to those marginalized populations, which we're going to talk about just a little bit more. And of course, you guys serve a marginalized population. Um, but these are just some facts that marginalized or people that have excluded from the mainstream or have lack of resources for whatever reason, they don't have inequitable access. They have inequitable access to hospitals and of course nursing homes. More likely to die in the hospital or, you know, in hospice with intensive treatment at the end of life. Not likely to be informed about those care options and are underrepresented in hospice and palliative care. Of course, some barriers to quality end of life care. I guess what I want to say is I'll drop down to the communication chasm. And again, that goes back to that trust factor. And I'll pause here, Mr. Don, to see if you or anyone else want to kind of speak to that, what you see from the inside as it relates to the barriers that can be identified when taking care of patients in corrections. Anyone want to speak to that?
Marquita, one of the things that you've touched on more than once is the whole concept of medical literacy or healthcare literacy.
Mm-hmm.
We deal with a population that by and large has had very little access to adequate health care throughout life.
Mm-hmm.
And it may come from a number of factors, one of which is that when they were outside the walls of the prison, they were focused on other priorities. They did not have a focus on taking care of themselves. And it may well have been, and many times was, because of the fact that they did not have the resources to be able to do that. But along with that is the awareness, the lack of awareness of healthcare issues and how those things affect so many aspects of your life.
Right.
You know, you talk to people about hypertension, you talk to them about diabetes, they've heard about cancer, but there are so many things that you and I may have grown up with, or certainly through our education, that we've become exposed to, that the vast majority of the population that we deal with in the correctional setting has not had a heavy exposure to. So a lot of what we do comes down to education.
Yeah,
right.
That can be awfully frustrating for the clinician as well as for the patient.
Right.
I mean, we can see that just in terms of folks trying to navigate the general healthcare system and how difficult that is, and you know how limited their medical education or their literacy is in the general population.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm sure it's even more frustrating inside of corrections.
Right.
Well, one of the things that we as professionals come to learn is how there is actually a healthcare and health issues lifestyle continuum. This affects this, affects this, affects this, affects this. And very few of the people that we deal with have that kind of an understanding of those interrelationships of how one thing affects another, affects another, affects another.
Connecting the dots.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a lot. I'm going to skip past that. I wanted to, wait a minute, when cultures clash, let me see if I can find it. I'm so sorry. So gender identification, of course, this is another issue, I'm sure. Gender expression and of course, sexual orientation this is yet another marginalized population. And I don't really know as far as within corrections, but I know that it's a marginalized population outside of corrections. So I would imagine that would certainly be a continuum there. When cultures clash, however, because despite the best efforts that we have trying to provide culturally sensitive care or being aware of, there's going to be some clashes that'll happen. And of course, understand the perspective, trying to understand my own reaction, or for you to understand your own reaction as you deal with someone whose culture and your culture is clashing right in that moment. Because keep in mind that as much as we have a responsibility to take that patient's culture seriously, because if we don't, it comes off as we're choosing to place our own values over those of different backgrounds. So those are things that we just have to keep in mind. And of course, offering information and education and using the use of cultural guides to facilitate some communication if you have to. Just being able to, these are some ways to kind of bring down or minimize the serious clash of cultures as it relates to end-of-life care.
Marquita, may I
Yes,
interject
yes,
something?
yes, sir.
I became involved when one of the nurses that we had, or one of the nursing assistants we had,
Uh-huh.
was banned from going in to take care of a particular patient. And she was an excellent nursing assistant.
Mm-hmm.
She was one of these ladies who had been involved with healthcare for years and years, and she knew what she was going to do and how she was going to do it. She went into the patient's room. It was cold. She looked around. She saw the window was up. Well, she just proceeded to go over, close the window, and she was going to take care of things. She was going to get that patient warm. What she didn't know, and what I didn't know until later on when I sat down and had the conversation with the family, was that culturally they were from an area of the Pacific Rim, one of the Southeast Asian countries, and they had a very strong belief that you made sure that air could flow in and out of the room, because this was how the spirits came and went as they ministered to this individual who was sick.
Mm-hmm.
So without knowing it, that nursing aide was keeping those spirits from getting to this terminally ill person and preparing them for death. I mean, it shocked me. The woman, when I talked to her later, she was extremely remorseful. She had no idea, but that's just it. Unless we are open, unless we are willing to listen, unless we are willing to communicate and have that willingness to self-critique and understand that there may be things going on here that I don't know about, then we cut ourselves off from being able to assist those families and those patients in the way that they want to be assisted.
That is exactly right. And I guess if I could speak further to that, it it affords us to be very open and not to allow, because I've seen situations where a caregiver or the person that's in the role of providing care, it was so obvious and so plain that they refused to not allow their beliefs and value system be put into place during the care of that patient. And it was so hard to watch because that patient felt totally disrespected. And it wasn't even a religious type thing, it was just a cultural thing. And so
Exactly.
we have to be so very cognizant of our own, going back to those biases and the implicit biases or those hidden biases that, we feel like, oh, I'm good, I love everybody, I treat everybody with respect, but then just checking and self-aware and checking ourselves constantly to see kind of where we stand, because you have to put those things away when you step into a room to provide care. They no longer ride the forefront, they kind of take the back seat, and that patient's cultural considerations or that patient's culture or that patient's spirituality comes to the front. Anyone else want to add a comment to this?
Cultural humility is necessary.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. And that, that is, when you think about just that whole idea of being humble, of being a person of humility, that's a person that's low, and for lack of a better way of putting it. And so being able to be culturally humble, and that is not thinking of ourselves in any better position than the next person for whatever reason. Thank you, Jamie. That was a good comment. Anyone else? So I guess there's a couple of case examples there. I couldn't get one to relate to as it related to to corrections, excuse me. Still asking if you guys have anything that, you could bring to light, because I feel that education and corrections will be ongoing. And I would love to have case examples to be able to plug into, and of course, to clean them up to where there's no identified factors, but just to be able to utilize these in our PowerPoint sessions, because I feel like corrections will continue to move forward in corrections. Anyone else? So from the domain 5 in the NCP guidelines, that's talking about that spiritual, religious, and existential aspect of care. IDT team serve every single patient, respect their spirituality, their practices, their beliefs, but they're also respectful when the patient doesn't want to talk about it. And from a global standpoint, what that looks like is, we acknowledge our own spirituality as a part of our role, and we are provided with education and support to look at the patients as much as we can, their ancestral spirituality, whatever that looks like. And of course, we address the spiritual needs of that patient as needed. And of course, in an ongoing aspect, that's going to be that patient's care needs, they can change, just like the goals of care can change, or so we have to keep that in mind as well.
Marquita,
Yes, yes.
one thing that came to mind, our focus is so often on pain relief.
Mm-hmm.
There are some cultures where pain associated with the dying process is viewed as preparation for the afterlife. And if we go in there just full bore, determine that we are going to do whatever it takes to alleviate their pain, we may be trampling on some very closely held beliefs for some of the people that we serve.
You are so right. And
they viewed it as preparation.
Yep. I was getting ready to say, being culturally aware doesn't mean that we have to know the ins and out of every single culture going in. Have to be teachable in some situations as it relates to cultures or value systems that are different from ours. You're exactly right. From a spirituality standpoint, of course, that's being able to make meaning, purpose, having a purpose, being able to forgive if that's the case, to love, to have hope, religious faith, and even transcendence. Religion, of course, that's more organized and that's based upon some religious beliefs. An example of Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and of course, being able to work the IDT team working across and allowing that chaplain or spiritual care and making referrals as are congruent with that patient and their needs is vital. Several examples of a spiritual assessment. This is one that's just simple, says FICA. And basically, the F stands for whether or not the patient has a faith belief or anything that gives him meaning to life. The I, is for importance or influence. How important is having a faith life to them, or how does faith influence your life? C is community, stands for community. Do you belong to a faith community? And if yes, how do they provide support to you? And of course, the A is for address. How would you like for the IDT team to integrate issues of spirituality, into your care? That's just an example of one of the many spiritual assessments that could be utilized as far as assessing that patient's spiritual life. Some examples of non-religious questions, of course, just saying, I know you're going through so much. Where do you get your inner strength? Where do you get the courage to keep going? Thinking about the future, what are you worried about? And opposite of that, what gives you comfort? What's satisfying to you right now? And what is it that you're hoping for? So, being able to utilize conversations or open-ended questions like this for those non-religious folks still gives an opportunity to have some spirituality questions. Of course, some questions that prompt an intervention. And of course, if that patient's talking about, what have I done to deserve this? I pray, but I'm still sick. I don't have any hope. It's all gone. What did my life mean? Well, I used to believe in God, but I'm not so sure now. These are the kind of the triggers that would indicate some concerns or some distress and may need to be explored a little bit further. Some spiritual care interventions, of course, that's being right there, being present, listening, some deep listening, some involved listening, listening to understand instead of listening to just have a response sometimes is important. Being able to bear witness, putting some compassion into action. Patient may need someone to act literally hold their hand or, just be there silent as they kind of unload some concerns or some feelings or some compressed feelings or that could go back way before the time that they have been incarcerated. Of course, having these interventions, what they can kind of do is just help them with some reconciliation, even finding themselves in where they are in self-worth and resolving some guilt or forgiveness, or even, just reestablishing that relationship with God or a higher being. I think this is another with end-stage heart. I'll bypass this unless someone wants me to. Like I said, and I'll keep reiterating this, to be able to have some conversations around end of life and corrections, ideas, or case examples, or things like that would really be beneficial to me. So we just have to recognize that culture, it influences every single aspect of life, especially during sickness and dying, the dying process, death, and even bereavement. To self-assess, of course, that's the first step if we want to be sensitive to others' cultures. How do my own beliefs, my own values influence my attitude or my behavior towards others? A lot of times it's those nonverbal gestures or cues that we have to be careful that we portray or that we put out there. May not be opening up our mouth, giving an opinion, but oftentimes we just have to be totally cognizant of what we are saying when we're not saying anything at all. And of course, being culturally and providing culturally and spiritually sensitive care. And that's being able to reach across every single discipline to make sure that that interprofessional care is well-rounded and it's well thought out, and that being able to obtain information from individual assessments, complete those assessments early, try to understand, but don't ever assume. Keeping in mind too, as I close, that spirituality, guys, that is equally important component of quality of life as physical, psychological, and social. We have to be able to assess for the spiritual needs and concerns and provide those appropriate interventions, whatever those look like. And culturally sensitive care is best provided across the disciplines in an interdisciplinary approach, using social workers, mental health, if needed, chaplains, because they provide that tremendous support in putting together that cultural assessment. Every encounter should be cross-culture. So the healthcare provider, we have to be flexible, sincere, and ethical in all of our interactions. All right, guys, that takes care of the PowerPoint session for today. I will pause here in the last 6 minutes and see if we have any comments or if anyone has a question as it relates to information that you guys heard today.
Was just wondering, as you was talking about this, if anyone on today's call, and not to mention names or anything like that, but if anyone has ever experienced or witnessed a cultural something that was culturally insensitive happening in front of you, and it was clicking in your head, this is just cultural insensitivity, and you identified as cultural. I was just wondering, has anybody seen anything like that happen in your area?
Hi, I'm Arthur Rose from Parchment, and I am formerly a hospice volunteer, and
Yeah.
I've seen numerous occasions where people just unaware of the person's culture, they have approached them with things that was really, really offensive. In Angola, we like Islamic. We had guys to go and tell them about Jesus, and
Yeah.
it eventually turned them off immediately.
Yeah.
So our practice was to get all Islamic volunteers to tend to this guy. And but again, I've seen a lot of people that don't understand the person's culture, and they've offended them.
Yeah. And I just want to say that's why it's really important that each site that's going to be hosting or having hospice volunteers, when you're selecting those volunteers, that you cast the net wide so that you have a variety of different faiths represented in that core. Culturally, you want diversity in every way, shape, and form that you can diversify your hospice volunteer core is going to enhance your hospice volunteer core.
Yeah, I think that is very vital that we have people like that, because even if you're not a part of a different religion, you can be educated about the beliefs and unbeliefs of a person.
And one of the things about hospice volunteers that's going to be very, very important is that you're going to continue. We're going to do some initial education with your guys, but you all are going to have to continue that sort of education. And part of that is having the guys in the group lead education about their culture, about their faith, about their beliefs, about illness, about we learn more the more we teach. And so when your hospice volunteers become the teachers, they learn so much more.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. I thank you, Mr. Rose. We remember back to those early days of hospice and how much fun the guys actually had learning about each other.
Mhm. I left there as a hospice volunteer and went to Rayburn, and we started
Yeah.
a program there, and I was able to teach a lot of guys about what I learned from the hospice in Angola. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope that today something has been said to spark or to encourage or to actually, or maybe even taught some aspects of remembering that culture and spirituality of the individuals that you serve in palliative care and hospice is just as vital as my culture and my spirituality. Because it's a humane act. Providing care at the end of life is a human being human, providing care to a human in spite of. And so that's just, I guess that's a good takeaway to take with you. If no one has any other questions, did you have a comment, Jamie? I'm sorry.
The only thing I want to say is our faith and our cultures become the framework for us interpreting the entire world around us. And, different people have different experiences of life, and that's going to give us all the uniqueness and the framework out of which we interpret the world around us. So that's why it's so vital that we do our best to try and understand folks that are not like us.
Right.
That are thinking differently, that believe differently, that feel differently. We can learn something from them. So
Absolutely.
I want to thank you all, and again I want to thank the Franciscan missionaries of Our Lady for Health System for making your continuing education possible today. If you would please, in the chat box right now, type in your name and your email address. And as each week we do, within 24 hours, you will be seeing an email that we will send to you with a link. You have to go to the link, complete the survey or the evaluation, and your certificate of participation will be found in your profile inside of our website. You have to log in using your username, and if you should have your own password, but if you haven't, you can use the temporary one we've set up at PASS1234 ! To get in the first time. Are there any other thoughts or questions before we end today's session?
I would just say real quick, there's a book that we used to use at the hospital that was really helpful. It was a little handy guide that told us about all the different religions across the world and how they prefer to have their body handled at the end of life or die, all the kind of things. That was a quick reference for us to have a little bit of an idea if I was about to walk in the room of someone who was Hindu, so that I could have a quick reference to go, okay, I've got a baseline to start from. And that was incredibly helpful. I'll try to find that book, but it'd be really good, I think, a resource if we could have that for our volunteers.
If you can find a PDF of that resource, that would really be helpful, because we'll put it on the training manual so that everyone would have access to that, because those little guides are very, very helpful in terms of helping us get out of a bind when we're not as smart or not as aware as we should be. Thank you. Any other thoughts, questions? Okay. Well, again, we thank you for your time and your attention today, and we will see you next week beginning at 1 o'clock, right, Marquetta?
1 o'clock, yes.
So an hour and a half session. So we will begin at 1 o'clock next week rather than 1:30. In the meantime, be careful, be safe. And Don, if you want to stay on after we are all finished, we can do some planning.
That'll be fine. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.